The digital transformation of digital rights. I'm Tonya Hall for ZDNet and Tech Republic, and joining me is Shahid Buttar, Director of Grassroots Advocacy at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Welcome, Shahid.
Thank you so much for having me, Tonya.
So what is the EFF and what do you do in your role there?
So the Electronic Frontier Foundation was founded in the 90s. We're a digital liberties nonprofit that works around the world through technology, through law, and through activism to defend the rights of users of technology. We fight government surveillance, we promote net neutrality, we ultimately guard freedom of expression across a variety of contexts. And my role here at EFF is to cultivate and nurture a national grassroots movement across the United States to defend digital rights in local communities across the United States.
So let's talk about digital rights and digital activism. Tell us about the proposed computer crime law that Electronic Frontiers Georgia mobilized to challenge.
So this was a law that in 2018 essentially threatened to escalate penalties that might be inhibitions to digital security researchers from doing their very important work to guard user security online. Security researchers quite regularly probe systems to detect vulnerabilities so they can then report vulnerabilities to content providers and to platforms so that they can then fix those vulnerabilities to protect their users. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is a federal statute which has long been used in an overbroad way that chills speech and expression by security researchers. In Georgia, the proposed law would have effectively extended those penalties across a broader array of contexts. And Electronic Frontiers Georgia, a grassroots group in the Electronic Frontier Alliance that we built here at EFF, went to the mat in 2018. They lobbied their state legislature. They reached out to academics, to cybersecurity professionals who informed the state legislature about the unforeseen consequences that the law was flirting with, particularly its potential harm to digital security by inhibiting people who form a crucial role in the security ecosystem from playing their role.
In another case, Chicago advocates helped defeat a state proposal to subject protesters to drone surveillance. Don't protesters forfeit privacy rights by demonstrating in public spaces? And doesn't law enforcement have a duty to protect the public in cases where protests turn violent?
It's a great question. In cases where protests turn violent, you don't need First Amendment restrictions to necessarily protect the public. So there's plenty of laws to address that. And as for whether or not one gives up one's privacy to appear in public, that's actually an area that's very much in flux in the law. It used to be the case long ago that people were allowed privacy interests only in spaces that they owned. And so it was a very cramped, trespass-based theory of privacy that the federal courts accepted. There's a famous case, Katz, which decades ago extended the right to privacy to include places where one is held to enjoy a reasonable expectation of privacy. And historically, under the Katz doctrine, courts have refused to recognize reasonable expectations of privacy in public spaces. And so I think that's maybe what you're referring to. However, just in the last several months, in the last Supreme Court term, in fact, the Supreme Court decided the Carpenter case, which has very crucial implications for precisely that question. In Carpenter, what the court essentially did was require a judicial warrant for law enforcement agencies to require from telephone companies cell site location information that would give away the location of subscribers. And in this case, this was a quite important law enforcement investigation into a series of robberies. And the Supreme Court said that one has a reasonable expectation of privacy in your records held by telephone companies. So the third party doctrine and the constructions of reasonable expectations of privacy that limited the recognition of privacy interests in the past, in that case, were held to support a recognition of a privacy interest beyond what the Katz doctrine had historically been read to allow. Finally, just one other point here. When you appear in public, not merely to go about your business, but particularly to participate in constitutionally protected dissent, there is an even greater interest in privacy, not only on the part of the individual, but reciprocally on the part of our society. The reason we have a First Amendment is not only to guard the rights of speakers, it is to guard democracy, which is to say we living in a democracy have an interest in limiting law enforcement to preserve a space for safe dissent that does not verge into acts that compromise other people's rights.
It seems that legislators continue to have a hard time keeping up with the pace of innovation. How does the EFF and its locals chapters work with legislators to educate them about technology and the current trends?
Great question. We don't exactly have local chapters, but we do have local allies, grassroots groups in the alliance that remain autonomous and pursue their own functions, but groups that we try to coach and guide. At EFF, we have a number of staff people whose primary function is to respond to requests for information from legislators, both members of Congress, as well as senators, as well as state legislators across the country. And we do our best to collect those requests, to conduct legislative analysis, and then provide it to those offices and those committees. At the local level, the grassroots allies who we cultivate often do the same, some of them more so than others. EFF Austin, for instance, in Austin, Texas, and Electronic Frontiers, Georgia, and Atlanta, they are two examples of grassroots networks that are very engaged in connecting with their state legislators. Some of the others, Oakland Privacy here in the Bay Area, Rhode Island Rights in the Northeast, these are also groups that are very engaged in not only the federal advocacy, but also connecting with local legislators, that is to say, people who serve on city councils and county boards. They also have a great deal of influence over many of these questions, and particularly around issues that relate, for instance, to law enforcement oversight and civilian review of local surveillance. There are a lot of opportunities for local officials to get ahead of the ball here. And we at EFF, as well as among our grassroots allies, are very eager to share information with policymakers at each layer of government.
A growing demographic is that of cyborgs, humans with electronic, prosthetic, or biological modifications. What are some of the legal issues related to merging human biology and advanced technology?
Well, to some extent, we're all cyborgs. You're wearing glasses, for instance. I do too myself. So like that makes us cyborgs insofar as we are wearing technology. What I think you're describing in terms of embedding technology, one of the legal issues that really comes to the fore here is the limitation through corporate trade secrets and intellectual property on the control that device owners can wield over their own devices. This gets particularly sharp if you think about medical devices like pacemakers. Oftentimes, people who might have these medical devices implanted within their bodies don't have the right, for instance, to read the data or affect the parameters that control the device. And that might seem innocuous to the extent you trust the corporate provider of the equipment. But at the end of the day, it really presses on our conception of ownership when you can own a device and yet not control it because the code that operates it remains effectively secret. This is an example of a way in which the intellectual property regime diminishes user rights.
Shahid Buttar, Director of Grassroots Advocacy at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. If somebody wants to connect with you, how can they do that?
Folks can visit us online at EFF.org or on Twitter or Facebook at EFF.
Thanks again. And if you guys want to find more of my interviews, you can do that right here on ZDNet or Tech Republic, or go to my website, tonyahall.net. I've got links to all my social sites. Thanks for watching.